Vi ska nu vidare direkt från Bryssel över till New York.
Ja, för där befinner sig ordföranden för The Humane League. Och det började med en liten djurrättsgrupp 2005 till att nu kunna skapa förändringar globalt. Vi säger hej och välkommen till David Coman-Hidy, och vi kommer också att byta språk.
Hi David, how are you?
Hey, good morning from Brooklyn.
God morgon. Or it's good morning for you, I think, not for us anymore so much.
That's right, yeah, good afternoon.
David, for the people who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about the Humane League?
Sure, yeah, so we're an international charity, and our mission is to end the abuse of animals raised for food. And we do this by influencing the policies of some of the world's biggest companies, by demanding legislation, and by empowering others to take action or to leave animals off their plate. We have staff in the US, in the UK, in Mexico, in Japan, and we work with many partner organizations on campaigns around the world, including our friends in Sweden at Rätt.
And let's talk a bit about you and your background. How did you end up at the Humane League and then later on as president of the organization?
Yeah, so I was really engaged in politics and political campaigns from a pretty young age, starting in like early high school, and then went to college to study politics and political science, and thought I wanted to have a career being a campaign manager in U.S. like statewide politics. And right after school, I volunteered a lot on campaigns and did all sorts of political activism. And then after school, worked on a political campaign, and ultimately decided that lifestyle probably wasn't going to be for me. And during that period, I had read Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and I really identified with what he said in that book, and came to feel that I could reduce the most suffering, do the most good by focusing my efforts on factory farming. So I was really happy to have the experience being involved in politics briefly, but decided to start looking on how I could move the needle for farm animals. So I joined the Humane League. I opened up the Boston office almost 10 years ago, back when we were just a few folks. Now we're a team of over 100 people around the world.
Wow, that's really amazing. But what lessons do you have from your experience working with political campaigns that can be translated into how we can achieve change for the animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the animal movement has a lot that we can learn from political campaigning. I think political campaigns and politicians in general are often looked down on to some degree as overly cynical or transactional. And when you're on a political campaign, the only goal that exists is just getting one vote more than the other person. And it's kind of like by any means necessary, whatever argumentation you need to use or messaging. And like there's this huge range of tactics that you can, that are available. And kind of everything is available to you on a political campaign. So I think that when you're working in politics, there's this sense that change, even if you have big idealistic ideas, change is going to happen very slowly. It's going to be difficult to achieve. It's going to involve compromise, and it's going to happen bit by bit. It's going to take many years to get where you want to go. And it also brings your idealism into contact with the real world, because you're knocking on the doors of voters. You're trying to persuade them of your point of view. And it also brings you into contact with people who hold a lot of power, like, I don't know, senators, other kinds of politicians. And there's a saying in politics that it's the art of the possible, right? It's just like whatever is the most realistic thing you can achieve to move the ball forward on your cause. And I think this point of view, it may have gone too far in some degrees, right, with politics, but I think the animal movement has quite a lot of room to move in that pragmatic direction, with a sense of focusing on what is really achievable. What are the next few steps for the movement to get to that world that we want to see?
But what do you say to those who wonder how we as a movement can ask for making just small steps of improvement when millions of animals are dying and suffering every day?
Yeah, I really sympathize with this point of view. When you think about how bad the situation is for farm animals right now, all around the world. And especially maybe if you're relatively new to the cause and maybe you've seen footage of treatment of animals on factory farms, you've seen slaughter footage. The status quo for animals is so upsetting right now. The scale of the problem is so large that it can feel too small to try and simply improve conditions rather than go for some kind of radical structural change that's going to change the world. The fact is, though, that this is the world we're living in, and the status quo is very bad for animals. And the people like us around the world are kind of given this responsibility to figure out what the best plan is given the situation we're in, as frustrating as that is. And I've spent many years asking people to go vegan, to join the movement to help animals directly. And some have done this, right? And I have many activist friends who've done the same thing. But that alone will not get us to where we need to go. That is not really a long-term strategy. That's essentially mostly a way to identify other activists who are going to help us. And that means that most of our resources, I think, have to be spent on a long-term strategy to build power and build influence so that one day we can take on those major structural changes that we all want to see and build that world that we all dream of, where animals aren't abused and killed on factory farms and fur farms and everywhere else. And I draw a lot of inspiration from other social movements. You know, I'm in the US, so that's my context. And I look at movements that have been successful in the not too distant past, right? Like the fight to win gay marriage is something I worked on when I was really young, like in high school. The way that the National Rifle Association has changed the meaning of the Second Amendment, the legalization of marijuana. You can go back to even the civil rights movement or the women's movement in the US. Any of these social movements that have been successful in creating the change they want, they've all taken an approach that's very long-term. You start with where society is at, you move the needle a little bit, you bring more people onto your side, you win over a few more politicians, you become a serious issue for people to talk about. I think we should take the same approach until we have evidence that there's a much stronger way to get things done. And of course, we shall be humble, right? Like the world changes around us, we'll need to change our strategy all the time. And there will be a time, I'm sure, for putting more resources into maybe like a more radical approach or approach that's asking for more. But right now, I think we need to separate that passion or anger that we might have around the situation and take that out of the kind of chess game that we also have to play right now. We need to hold both.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us into the next question, which is, would you prioritize being pragmatic or pragmatism or idealism? And before we get into that, could you please explain the difference for our participants?
Sure, yeah. So I would define pragmatism as kind of that political mindset I was talking about before, the sense of focusing on what is realistic, what's possible, just thinking about like the next steps ahead of us, what the status quo is and how we can change it a little bit. And then I think idealism in this context, I would define as that vision that probably everyone out there has who's watching this, of a world that is completely different, where our relationship with other animals is not one that's based on abuse and killing. And I don't know if I would actually say that one is more important than the other, because I really think you need both. I think the idealism is what kind of keeps us getting up in the morning. It's what pushes us to keep fighting and to overcome setbacks and to stay motivated through a lifetime of activism. On the other hand, the pragmatism is kind of more the day-to-day, hour-to-hour. How are we going to make decisions about how we spend our very precious time and money? What are the programs that we think are going to be most effective in helping animals? So I think it's very important for activists to have a split of these two ways of approaching the problem. Because I think you can err too far on the side of pragmatism. If you lose like the fire in your belly, for the cause, there is a risk that maybe you compromise too much, or you become kind of disillusioned with the work, or you're unable to inspire others. On the other hand, I think we're probably all aware of activists who are all passion and no strategy, where they might be kind of almost inspirational in how passionate they are, but fail to achieve the kind of long-term change that we want to see. So I think it's important to have both.
Yeah, and what would you say? Would you describe the reason for being pragmatic as something that is right because it's rational, or as something we should do because it's morally right to do so?
Yeah, I definitely feel very strongly that we have a moral obligation to have this kind of pragmatic mindset. The reason for that is relatively simple. I mean, when we're making a choice between a campaign, let's say, maybe a pragmatic campaign, let's call it, where we can create some kind of incremental change for animals and raise awareness around our issue, or something that is more about like expressing our passion and our anger around this issue, or something that's more about activists speaking truth. The ones who pay the cost for this are the animals. You know, you always have to put yourself in the point of view of, the hen who's inside of the cage or the cow on the feedlot. What is it that they would benefit from? And what do they care about? And the things that they care about are the conditions of their life, the way that they're going to be confined for their entire life, how they're going to be killed, whether or not they're going to be transported. These are the meaningful issues to them. And I think that we have a moral obligation to consider first what it is that will impact those who we're saying we're trying to help. And we have to put what makes us feel personally good after that, because ultimately what we're here for is to change the world for animals, not to express ourselves or to speak truth to power or anything else. So I do feel strongly that there's a very deep moral reason to take a pragmatic approach.
Yeah, and as a person that works globally with animal rights, do you have any thoughts on how we in Sweden what kind of animals we should work on, or what kind of methods we should use? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I would say all of you are definitely the experts on what exactly to do in Sweden, but I do have some kind of like general strategy thoughts, I suppose. I think countries like Sweden, where you have a really strong movement thanks to groups like Rätt, and where there's a very high level of social awareness around animal issues. There's a high level of vegetarianism and veganism compared to other countries where social change is something that seems quite possible, and where there's like just a lot of interest and excitement around this issue. It's a wealthy, progressive country relative to a lot of others. I think that the exciting opportunity for folks like you and others on this call is that Rätt in Sweden and the advocates living there, we kind of rely on you and the rest of the world to set a high bar. Like, there's some countries where we're just getting the movement started, where advocates are just starting to build a little momentum. And I think they can look to countries like Sweden to say, this is where we want to be in a few years. We want to have this powerful social movement behind us. We want to have huge membership of folks who are out there willing to do the work to create change. I mean, just in the last few weeks, the number of victories, the corporate commitments that Rätt has won has just been crazy. My team was just talking about it the other day, the number of emails coming out. I mean, that's something that's really inspirational for other advocate groups to see. So I think probably number one is just keep up the good work would be what to do next. But yeah, please keep setting a high bar for the rest of us.
That sounds great. We will do that. And both Djurens Rätt and the Humane League are part of a bigger alliance that is called the Open Wing Alliance, which was initiated by you guys. Could you please tell us a bit more about this alliance? And you were just mentioning the corporate part of it.
Yeah, so one of the biggest lessons that we've learned in the US doing corporate campaigning is that when advocacy groups started coordinating together and working closely, so planning the same campaigns against big companies or kind of dividing and conquering, splitting up who's going to do the corporate outreach and who's going to be campaigning and who's going to do investigations and so forth, that we became way more effective. That's when we started to see literally hundreds of commitments and corporate victories rolling in. And we all were able to learn quite a lot from each other because each group here kind of has their own different specialty. So we wanted to take some of what we learned in the US about these kind of coordinated campaigns on the corporate side on issues like cage-free or improving the lives of broiler chickens, and see if we could expand that internationally. So a few years ago, we met with a number of groups, mostly in Europe, did some shared trainings with each other on how we had been winning campaigns. And then we started launching campaigns together, targeting some of these international companies. And in the last few years, it's grown a lot. It's now got over 80 members from all over the world, literally from Australia to Asia to Africa, all across Europe, all across Latin America. And we're now winning huge numbers of global campaigns. We're able to influence economies that otherwise would be very difficult to campaign in, doing kind of like aggressive pressure campaigns. And I think that this is a really good kind of next phase for the animal movement for two reasons. So one is kind of the more short-term strategic reason, in that we're able to push through these commitments and start to create real change in places where we probably wouldn't be able to found large animal groups to do campaign work. And the second, and this is more important, is long-term, is that we want to help create an environment in the animal movement where people don't think of just their country or just their organization or just their campaign, but instead think of the animal movement as kind of the organization that all of us work for. And each group is kind of like a department within that organization, right? And that we're all going to be more successful if we're extremely generous, if we share resources and train each other and celebrate each other's successes. And I think there's been a big openness from all the organizations to this new way of thinking that has led to a lot of success, and I think has built a really great community around the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned broiler chickens, but could you explain first what broiler chickens are, but also explain how the work with cage-free and broiler chickens will affect the animal rights movement at large?
Sure. So broiler chickens, that's an industry term, are the chickens who are raised and killed for meat. And they're an entirely different kind of bird than the chickens who are in cages or on cage-free farms laying eggs. They live a much shorter time before they're killed. They are bred to grow very large rather than to lay lots of eggs. So there's kind of two different campaigns addressing the way that the broiler chickens suffer, and the other is, of course, to get the laying hens out of cages. And like taking cage-free as an example, in terms of how this kind of work fits into the big picture, what does this mean for animal rights? Why does this contribute towards this far-out goal of having a different world for animals? Well, one reason that I find the cage-free work appealing is that in the short term, it just reduces a lot of suffering for hundreds of millions of animals. So I think on its own, that is a really good reason to do this kind of work, that we're saying that every year, hundreds of millions of animals who previously would not have been born into a situation where they could even spread their limbs or turn around are now going to be outside of a cage. So that's worth doing in itself. But I actually think the second reason, and this is more important, is that this is the first time that I think globally the animal movement has had in its sights a real major victory for animals. There's been a lot of victories along the way, including what's happened in Europe to get rid of barren cages, some of the statewide laws that have passed in the US. But I think that as a movement, what we need to do is keep our eyes on the prize of getting rid of this practice around the world. And I think that that would be a really significant milestone for us to have achieved as a movement, where we can say that we are organized enough around the world, that we're powerful enough to take on these enormous multi-billion-dollar industries, global industries, and create real change. And that's something that would not have seemed possible even a few years ago. So I think that it's of critical importance that groups like Djuren's Right, the groups in the Open Wing Alliance, continue to build on the successes that we've seen until we've kind of wiped battery cages from the earth until it's just in the history books. And then I think as a movement, we will have really proven ourselves and we can take on something much bigger as the next step.
And what would you say is the biggest obstacle in the animal rights movement today? And also, what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I guess the obvious answer is just that we're not really big yet, right? Like, there aren't that many of us. We don't have that much money. The groups aren't that big compared to other causes that we probably care about. But the good news is that's changing pretty quickly. You know, all of our groups are, you know, gaining more success, gaining more size and power, which is good. So I think the thing that's most on my mind these days, and this is definitely true in the US, it's less true in some countries in Europe for sure, but mostly it's true around the world, is that I don't think our movement has very much political power. So that's why I'm really excited about projects like Your Group for Animals, for example, that are focused on this. But I think eventually, you know, the corporate strategy can only get us so far. We are going to need to build real political power. And I mean, this is what animal rights is, right? It's passing laws to protect animals. And that's something that's complicated, and it takes a very long time to build up the power and ability to do this. It takes a lot of coordination and strategy. So I think we all need to, as advocates, be thinking long-term about that next step of kind of the next phase when we move more and more into the realm of politics, in addition to the work we do reaching individuals and reaching companies. So I think that all of our groups need to be investing some time in thinking about how we're going to get there in our respective countries. Otherwise, we might be in a situation where we'll have started too late, and it's going to take a very, very long time to build up that influence.
And we talked about it a little bit before, but what differences do you see if we talk about Sweden versus the US? What differences do you see between the animal rights movements in both countries?
Well, I think obviously there's just very different contexts, right? So the US, some of the challenges we face are that media in particular is very difficult to break into because the country is so large. So to get national media in the major papers or television is just very difficult because there's so much competition, and our news cycle is so crazy, and there's so much going on right now that it's very, very difficult to kind of break through as like, this is a national idea we're going to get in front of everyone. Everyone's going to have heard about this campaign. I think that's something that's more challenging for countries like the US. We also have a lot of benefits though, right? Like we have a ton of people. We have states like California, Massachusetts, where we can run ballot initiatives where just through activist work, you can get onto the ballot and have people vote for your issue, which is really exciting. And there's a lot of money here, and there's a lot of philanthropy. So we're able to, that's one of the things that Humane Alliance does, is we take money from philanthropists in the US and we distribute it to other organizations around the world. So I think, you know, every country, Sweden included, of course, has their own sets of kind of like challenges and advantages. And I think it's up to our groups to kind of figure out how we adapt into that position. How do we best take advantage of the situation that we're in? And like I said before, I think Sweden, you're really advanced in building up public consciousness about the issue. My wife is Swedish, and I have a lot of Swedish in-laws, so I've just always been surprised that everyone I meet when I'm in town is a very high level of awareness about animal issues and the treatment of animals on farms compared to the US. So I think that that puts you in a good position to do these kind of public-facing campaigns that you've obviously had a lot of success with.
Yeah, and to sum it all up, if there are any participants out there that want to get involved in the animal rights movement, what are your best words of advice for them?
Yeah, good question. Well, I guess I'll directly address all those folks who might be on this call. I know that it can be really frustrating or sad to think about the situation that animals are in, or it can feel hopeless because of how big the obstacles are, how big and powerful some of the companies are that we're fighting against. But I've been working in this movement now for 10 years, which isn't that long compared to some people, but it's pretty long if you're new. And I have just been shocked by how much progress we have made during those 10 years. It is far more than I would have predicted as possible, and we're growing as a movement every year. And I think I would encourage you, those feelings of frustration or the feelings of sadness about the situation animals are in, the only way to address those, to immediately make yourself feel better, is to get involved and be part of the change for animals. And you have an amazing opportunity in front of you, especially if you're living in Sweden. It is incredibly easy for you to be part of the solution. So you go online, go to the Djuren's website, you can start making a monthly donation, you can sign up to volunteer, get involved. I mean, if you do that right now, I promise tomorrow you're going to feel a lot better. And over the course of years, you're going to be part of changing the world for animals. So I think you have a really exciting opportunity. Focus on the progress that we can win and have a great time doing it. Yeah, so get involved.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David Coman-Hidy.
Thanks for having me.